My stepmother falsely accused me of harassing her to deprive me of my father's inheritance. He believed her and cut ties with me. But 7 years later, he learned the truth. Hi everyone, my biological parents divorced when I was 9, and they split custody of me equally. I lived with mom 5 days a week because she lived near my school, and I spent weekends with dad. Despite the divorce, my parents always treated me well. Though I was sad about their breakup, I understood they loved me regardless of their relationship. A couple of years later, my dad met my stepmother, Gina. When he first introduced her to me, I was 11. She seemed very nice, and Dad looked happy. I hoped we'd get along. She had twin daughters, Emma and Emily, who were 14 at the time. Their father had disappeared from their lives since their birth, so Gina raised them alone. Because of this, the girls were quite immature for their age, throwing tantrums in public if Gina and my dad didn't buy them what they wanted or if things didn't go their way. I was an introvert and their complete opposite, so I just quietly watched their antics. A year into their relationship, Gina and my dad decided to get married. I was 12, and even mom attended their wedding. I was glad our family was growing bigger and thought I got along with my stepmother. But as it turned out, my ignorance lasted only a few months after their honeymoon. One morning, when we were alone, she told me she didn't like me and that we just needed to pretend we got along when Dad was around. She added that when Dad wasn't home, I shouldn't bother her because she hated seeing my face. It reminded her too much of my mom. My little heart shattered from her cruel words. I hadn't expected this. I really liked her and thought our relationship would be good. But she didn't feel the same. Of course, the twins overheard her words, and later, they started bullying me, saying I didn't have a real dad, and that my dad loved them more than me. I remember crying and telling Mom about it. She immediately called Dad and gave him an earful. Dad assured her that Gina could never say something like that to me, and that I probably misunderstood her. The next weekend, when I went to Dad's, Gina looked irritated. She didn't say a word in Dad's presence, but as soon as he left, she hissed at me that she'd make sure I no longer had a dad if I ever told Mom anything about her again. She also threatened to divorce Dad, take all his money, and leave him broke if I didn't keep my mouth shut. I was only 12 and feared for my dad, so I just nodded in agreement. From that day, Gina made it her mission to turn my life into hell. I was a kid and thought I just had to endure it silently. When we were alone, she'd say nasty things to me, and I'd stay quiet, praying she'd stop tormenting me. She mocked my height and weight, calling me ugly. I hoped Dad would notice something, but he didn't. Worse, he thought Gina and I had a good relationship and made me go shopping or eat out with her and her daughters. She'd use Dad's card to pay for our restaurant trips, but wouldn't let me eat anything substantial. I was allowed only soup or dessert, not a main course. I'd sit there pathetically, watching them finish their meals, crying quietly, then go home hungry. She made me go to bed with an empty stomach on so many nights, crying myself to sleep, exhausted by her hatred toward me. By that point, I was on edge, scared, angry, and disappointed in both Gina and Dad. Because of this, I started dreading weekends at Dad's. On Fridays, I'd try to find any excuse to stay with Mom, like saying I had a stomachache. Of course, my parents noticed, and Dad would call, saying how sad he was not to see me. Mom urged me to tell her what was wrong, but I kept quiet, still fearing Gina's threats. When I was 14, Dad decided to take the whole family, me included, on a trip to Greece. I wanted to go at first, but Mom said it'd be a good chance for me to see the world. Reluctantly, I agreed. As usual, Gina pretended to be kind and caring in front of Dad, hugging me and asking about school as if she genuinely cared. I started noticing she'd subtly mock me with her sweet voice. It was insulting but not overtly malicious. For example, when I mentioned playing basketball, She joked that I needed to be taller to play the sport, even though I was pretty tall for my age. Then she'd say I should focus on academics, not sports, if I wanted to achieve anything in life. The twins would smirk while I said her comments hurt me, but Dad insisted Gina was just joking, and that I needed to take it lightly. Gina would nod, and add that I had no sense of humor, and should learn to have fun like she did. This went on throughout the trip. One day, in a fit of anger, when she and the twins mocked me about my weight again, while I tried to enjoy the pool, I decided to strike back. I told the twins they both had double chins, which looked ridiculous, and watched their faces darken with offense. Then I turned to Gina and said she shouldn't wear a cover-up over her bikini because her huge belly was visible anyway, making her look like a penguin. I saw Gina's face flush with embarrassment, and she ran to the hotel room. The twins screamed at me, accusing me of sexism and calling me awful. Later, they told Dad, and he came to talk to me, clearly angry. He asked if I'd really said those things about Gina and my stepsisters, and when I nodded, he scolded me, saying he'd raised me better, and that I should never speak about a woman's appearance like that. I argued that they constantly commented on my weight, appearance, and height, but Dad made me apologize to Gina, who, it turned out, had locked herself in the bathroom crying after my words. Gina and the twins put on a whole show, dramatically accepting my apology. When I got home, I told Mom everything, of course. She talked to Dad again, who tried to blame it all on me, but Mom threatened to report Gina to authorities if she ever made comments about my weight or appearance again. Surprisingly, this snapped Dad into action, and Gina never said anything to me again. Of course, she and the twins ostentatiously ignored me when Dad wasn't around, but honestly, that suited me fine. When I was 16, Mom went away for a few days, and I had to stay with Dad and Gina. Gina complained to Dad for days about how tiring it was to cook for one more person. On the last day of my stay, I decided to cook dinner myself, as Mom had taught me to be self-sufficient from a young age. When Gina found out I was cooking, she said she wanted to invite a few of her friends over. I cooked, set the table, and served dinner to everyone. The food seemed to be a hit, and I even got compliments. Later, Dad decided to wash the dishes while I went to my room. There, I overheard Gina and her friends talking loudly near my window. Her friends said how lucky she was to have such a great husband and beautiful home. When they mentioned how nice it was that I cooked for them, Gina immediately complained about how annoying I was, and how much she hated seeing me. She told her friends she couldn't wait until I turned 18, so she wouldn't have to see me every weekend. When one of her friends again said I'd made a good impression, Gina replied that she'd actually expected me to fail, and hoped I'd ruin the meal, so she'd have a reason to mock me. I was shocked. I tried to be polite to her despite knowing she hated me. But it seemed she'd already made up her mind, and had no intention of changing. Over time, her hatred for me only grew. During college, I'd visit Dad for a few days at his insistence, but even then, Gina completely ignored me. She'd plan family events just with Dad and the twins, often leaving me alone at home. Every time I slept in late, since it was my vacation, for heaven's sake, she'd scream at me, calling me pathetic. She'd say I was lazy and careless if I left any mess, even though I always cleaned up after myself. I knew I was always respectful to her. Dad would have torn into me if I weren't, and I was careful not to say or do anything that might upset her. But it always felt like I was doing something wrong. Worse, she completely disregarded my personal space, barging loudly into my room while I slept to wake me up or entering without knocking, causing me immense discomfort. Sometimes, she'd peek into my room or under my bed, searching for something. I couldn't figure out what. She refused to buy dinner for me, even though she did for the whole family, and didn't invite me to the table. Still, I bit my tongue, kept my head down, and tried to spend time with Dad when I could. Now, let's get to the key event. When I turned 21, Dad asked me to visit him, saying he had important news to share. I hadn't visited in a while, so I felt a bit nervous, but Mom convinced me to go, saying he had good news for me. I agreed and bought tickets. When I arrived, Dad met me at the airport with warm hugs, and we drove to his house. I asked what he wanted to tell me, but he assured me he'd reveal everything over a family dinner. When we got there, I noticed the twins were home too. I hadn't seen Emma and Emily in ages. They didn't even bother to look at me, and I ignored them in return. That evening, at the family dinner, Dad started talking about how proud he was to have 3 wonderful kids. He spoke about how grateful he was for such a loving family, and that he wanted to share exciting news. The atmosphere felt positive, and I couldn't help but feel anticipation for something good. As Dad continued, he looked at each of us with a smile, including Gina, who'd been shooting me icy glares all day. Dad went on, saying he'd recently lost a friend to a heart attack, which had made him reflect on how lucky he was to have us all. He also mentioned he'd talked to a lawyer and drafted a will. Hearing the word will, I noticed Gina and the twins perk up immediately. Dad continued, saying he'd thought it through carefully and decided to leave the house to Gina, as she was his wife. Gina smiled proudly and kissed him on the cheek. Dad's house had 5 bedrooms, so if Gina chose to sell it, she'd make a fortune. Then he said he'd leave me his entire pension account and his car. But Dad's car wasn't just any car. It was a vintage vehicle he'd poured money and time into. It held huge sentimental value for us both, as he often told stories of his youth and adventures with it. I sat there, processing this, realizing that by leaving me the car, Dad was expressing his love for me. As Dad started talking about how proud he was to pass the car to me, Gina's expression shifted from pride to displeasure. She exchanged looks with the twins, who looked equally upset. It was clear the prospect of me inheriting the valuable vintage car filled them with envy and resentment. Dad, seemingly oblivious to the tension in the room, continued, saying he'd leave the twins a joint bank account he'd maintained with Gina. Gina was a homemaker, so all the money in that account belonged solely to Dad. He added that he wanted the money split evenly between them, ensuring they'd have both the house and funds to live comfortably if anything happened to him. I completely agreed with this decision. It seemed fair to everyone. However, the twins immediately expressed their dissatisfaction, saying they'd expected more, and that Dad should have left me the pension account since I supposedly didn't need it. When Dad asked why they thought that, Gina started arguing that I was a man and should find my own path in life, while they, as women, needed more money for financial stability. Dad reminded Gina that he'd already set up college funds for her daughters, and now they get the house and bank account, so they had nothing to worry about. Gina kept insisting I didn't deserve that money, but Dad firmly stated his decision was final. I sat silently, listening to their argument, when suddenly, out of nowhere, Gina burst into tears. Dad and I looked at her, concerned, and he said there was no reason for tears since everything had been divided fairly. Sobbing, Gina started saying she'd stayed silent all these years to protect the family, but couldn't bear it anymore. An awkward silence fell over the room, and Dad and I exchanged confused glances. Despite the tension, Dad gently asked Gina to explain what was weighing on her. Sobbing, Gina began claiming that for years I'd supposedly had inappropriate intentions toward her, but she'd hidden it to protect me. I was stunned by the accusation. Before I could process it, Gina started detailing her false claims, telling Dad that after our trip to Greece, where we'd argued about weight and height, I'd allegedly started staring at her constantly and trying to enter her bedroom uninvited. I froze in my chair as she continued fabricating a story about how I'd allegedly tried to barge into the bathroom every time she showered or got too close to her when we were alone. She told Dad that every weekend, my presence in the house terrified her because she feared I might do the same to the twins. I tried to defend myself, furiously denying these baseless accusations and yelling at her for daring to make up such lies. But Gina kept crying, playing the victim. She said that as I grew older, I scared her more, claiming that once, when we were alone, I'd supposedly tried to harass her. My eyes widened in shock, and blood drained from my face at hearing such a serious accusation. Dad looked bewildered and worried, his gaze darting between me and Gina, clearly unsure what to think. Gina kept spinning her lies, saying she'd suffered silently for years, afraid to speak out for the sake of the family. I shouted at Gina, calling her a psychopath, saying there was no way I'd ever look at her inappropriately, let alone touch her. Gina screamed back, saying she wouldn't stay quiet anymore and had to expose the monster she called me. The twins joined in, shouting at me furiously, accusing me of making their mother endure all this, calling me names like predator and pervert. My head spun. It felt like a nightmare. I couldn't believe how a pleasant evening had turned into a torrent of wild accusations against me. I looked at Dad, hoping for support, but he stayed silent, clearly trying to process what Gina had said. He asked her if what she was saying was true, and Gina nodded, insisting she'd never lied to him about his own son and that, as his wife, she deserved his trust. While I tried to defend myself, Dad asked her why she hadn't mentioned this earlier. Gina said she'd been afraid no one would believe her since I was a minor who'd allegedly done something inappropriate, claiming her words wouldn't have been taken seriously. She added that she'd endured it silently for the family's sake. By this point, I was crying, begging Dad not to believe her. I never imagined Gina would stoop so low as to fabricate such horrific lies, even after all the years she tormented me. Sadly, Gina's manipulation destroyed my relationship with Dad, who seemed torn between trusting me or believing the woman he'd married. The twins, swayed by their mother's story, backed Gina's false accusation and screamed at me to get out of their house. I yelled back that it was my dad's house, and they shouldn't believe their mother's lies, but Dad stayed silent. Then he looked at me and said I needed to leave the house while he figured things out. It felt like a punch to the gut to be rejected by my own father, who chose to believe his second wife over his son. Hurt, confused, and betrayed, I packed my things and left the house I considered mine. I flew straight to Mom, who was shocked to see me at her door. When I told her everything, she was furious and ready to confront Gina, but I asked her not to, fearing how far Gina's psychopathic behavior might go. If she could invent such insane accusations just to kick me out of Dad's house because she resented me inheriting, she might fabricate even more lies to ruin my life. I couldn't risk it and decided to cut ties with Dad forever. If he chose to believe her, he didn't deserve to be part of my life. Later, Mom told me Dad called her, saying he was ashamed to have a son like me and wanted nothing more to do with me. Mom tried to defend me, but her words were ignored. She also faced condemnation from Dad's family, who believed the story and claimed she'd raised a pervert. I can't imagine how painful it was for Mom to hear such things about her son. Clearly, the damage was done and Gina had won. I wish I could say my life improved after cutting ties with them, but it didn't. Gina and the twins kept sending me streams of abusive messages and threats, telling me to stay away from Dad. It got so bad I had to change my phone number to escape them. Even after that, my life didn't get better because, after what Gina did, I started fearing being around women. I was terrified of being falsely accused of something similar again, which could destroy my career in life. I was scared to date or go on dates. All this time, Mom was there, believing in me, I went through a severe depression, and Mom flew to me for a couple of months to support me. Gradually, my mental state started improving, and I began living again. Eventually, I met an amazing woman named Mara, who brought light into my life. She completely changed my life, and Mom adores her too. Mom and Mara are everything to me, and thanks to them, I found purpose in living again. A week ago, I got a call from an unknown number. Thinking it might be Amazon, I answered, and to my shock, I heard Dad's voice. I was stunned. His voice sounded older. I asked how he got my new number, as only a few family members knew it, but Dad dodged the question and asked how I was doing. I stayed silent, then told him not to contact me again since I had nothing to say to him. At that moment, Dad broke down crying, begging me to forgive him and repeating how awful he'd been for abandoning his own son. My curiosity grew, and I waited for an explanation. Then Dad started telling me that Gina had been cheating on him with his best friend for years. When he confronted her with proof, she didn't even try to deny it, and said she was tired of being married to such a pathetic man. Gina admitted she'd married him only for his money and hated being with someone like him. When Dad demanded the truth, she finally confessed she'd fabricated all those accusations against me because she hated me too and wanted all of Dad's estate to go to her and her daughters, as she claimed they deserved it. As you can imagine, Dad divorced her, and she got nothing from the marriage since she'd had an affair, though her lawyers tried to get alimony but lost. Dad continued, saying he'd waited until he divorced Gina to officially reach out to me and apologize for everything he'd put me through. He said he wanted to make up for lost time and build a better father-son relationship. At the mention of father and son, I couldn't hold back a bitter laugh. I told him he wasn't my father anymore after so easily turning his back on me because of his wife's vile accusations. I added that I wanted nothing to do with him and asked him not to contact me again. I hung up, hoping he'd get the hint. But since then, I've been flooded with calls from Dad and his relatives, people I don't even talk to. They say Dad has suffered enough, and that I'm only making things harder for myself. Crushed by these messages, I'm wondering if I'm wrong for refusing to reconnect with Dad after he turned his back on me because of Gina's false accusations. So, let's pause the story right now and answer the author's question before moving to the updates. Update 1. To clarify, I'm angry at my dad not just for believing my stepmother over me, but also for doing nothing to protect me all those years she tormented me. I've never told anyone about this, but I think it's time to open up and tell Mom everything because I know she'll understand me. Update 2. A week has passed since my last update. For everyone worried about my mental health, I'm doing okay. Thank you for your kindness. Now to the point, I bought tickets for Mom to come to me so I could tell her and Mara everything. They already knew something was wrong with me. I started explaining how Dad contacted me after all these years, which shocked Mom. She asked why he did that, and I explained. She didn't know he divorced and was furious about what Gina did to all of us. Then I told them both how Gina manipulated me, how she bullied me when Dad wasn't home, and threatened to divorce him if I told him anything. I didn't realize how traumatic these events had been for me, recounting each incident one by one. By the time I finished, tears were streaming down my face. Mara and Mom were quietly crying too. Mom stood up to hug me, repeating that I shouldn't have kept it all inside, and that it was good I shared it. I cried for half an hour while Mom hugged me. Mara said no child should have gone through that, and that it's completely normal if I never want to reconnect with Dad, as he should have protected me better. Mom agreed and said I don't owe Dad any explanations because, when I needed him most, he chose to believe his wife over me. The only reason he's trying to reach out now is that he's lonely and has no family left. That's when I realized they were probably right. Maybe my dad never truly loved me. If he had, And if he really knew who I was, he'd never have believed I was capable of harassment. Since that conversation, my decision has been finalized. After years, I feel so much lighter having told Mom and Mara everything about what I went through with Gina. I blocked Dad, and will continue blocking any family member who tries to interfere in my life. I owe no one explanations, especially those who chose to turn their backs on me. Update 3. Wow, I posted this 6 months ago, and I can't believe how much my life has changed since then. I want to start with the good news. I proposed and she said yes. My mom is thrilled for us, and we're considering moving closer to her because the schools are better there. We can both work remotely, so it makes sense for our future. I also started therapy. Thanks to advice from people here, it's helping me gradually feel better. I'm focusing on the good things in my life, Mara and my mom. They've always been there, and I'm grateful for their support. The past was tough, but I'm looking to the future with optimism, free from lies and drama. And with that, the story ends.